Thing you have to understand when we talk about morality is there is a famous distinction called the is-ought distinction that's keen in morality. This is a primary idea. See, the idea of moral laws, moral duties, moral obligations are things one ought to do, not necessarily just what is. The is-ought distinction. I've given the example before of the idea of ice cream versus insulin when we talk about preferences, okay? How many of you in here like chocolate ice cream? Wow, you're more than most when I ask that question. How many like vanilla? Okay, so it's almost 50-50, yeah. Oh, 50-50 bars. How many like, no, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go, my childhood again. Ice cream is a preference. This is what C.S. Lewis was talking about at the beginning. Right? It's not that this thing pleases me or this thing doesn't please me. If I like vanilla rather than chocolate, it would be incorrect for someone to come up and say, well, that's immoral. How can you like vanilla rather than chocolate? Chocolate is obviously the better flavor. And we use this talk, right? Chocolate is better than vanilla, or vanilla is better than chocolate. But when we use that word better, we don't mean morally superior. We mean it is our preference. We desire it more personally. So the fact that we desire something personally doesn't mean that it's morally better. When we talk about morality, we mean something different than preference, like ice cream. It's more like insulin. Okay, if you're a diabetic, first of all, don't eat the ice cream. If you're diabetic and you have to take an insulin injection every day, you may not like it. Needles are not my favorite thing. But if I have to take an insulin injection every day, it doesn't matter whether I like it or not. I'm going to do it. Why? Because insulin is prescriptive. It will do something to help me regardless of whether I like it or not. You can change your preference on ice cream with absolutely no ill effects whatsoever. You can move to rainbow sherbet or what have you, and it makes no difference. You can't change your preference on whether you take insulin and decide to say, I'm going to substitute the insulin with, I don't know, Starbucks. If I take a Starbucks every morning instead of my insulin, I should be fine, right? Doesn't work that way. Insulin is an ought. It's what you ought to take if you want to stay alive. If you want to stay alive and you're diabetic, you ought to take insulin. Whether you actually do, separate question. So what your preferences are is an is. That is what's true. What you ought to do is something prescriptive. It tells you what you should be doing in the future in order to achieve a result. You following me? Moral language always uses these prescriptive terms. One ought not be unkind to his neighbor. One ought to care for his fellow man, even if you don't do it. It's true that these is-ought pieces come into play. Moral obligations include actions that we must do. Say, help a man when he falls in the middle of the street. That's something that we should do. And certain actions that we must refrain from doing, even if it may please us. So taking advantage of the drunk girl in college is something that one ought not to do. Whether he did it or not is a second question, but we at least agree on the idea that one ought not to do that. You see the difference? It's prescriptive. It's a legal concept. It's like driving on the street here. One ought to obey the speed limit. Now, how many people actually obey the speed limit? Separate question. David Hume, which was an Enlightenment philosopher, came up with this idea, this law, that one cannot derive an ought from an is. Just because something is true, it doesn't then follow that that thing ought to be true. And this is a mistake a lot of people make. Okay? So, in other words, just because the world has been a certain way, for example, slavery. For most of the world's history, a significant portion of the world's population were enslaved. Even today, in certain countries of the Middle East, there is slavery that happens. Just because that's the way it always has been doesn't mean that the world ought to be that way. it may be such that it ought to be another way. Matter of fact, Jesus used this very argument in when he was talking about divorce. Remember? They asked him about the woman getting married to 7, right? She was married and the guy died, and then his brother married his brother, and his brother died, and his brother died on top of that. So I don't know what she's cooking, but I don't want any. Anyway, goes through the 7 brothers, and then last she dies, right? And or the man who comes to him, they came to him with another woman, I'm sorry, and said, you know, Moses says that he can give her a certificate of divorce. What do you say? And Jesus says, no. It was only for the hardness of your heart that Moses, and he corrects him, allowed divorce, but it was never meant to be from this way. Jesus says God knew that divorce is a reality because you guys are knuckleheads. You're hard-hearted, and if we don't allow divorce, the women, you know, they're probably going to start doing a Henry VIII thing, right? Couldn't get divorced, so he starts chopping the heads off his wives. So God allowed the divorce. He didn't command it. You've misread the scriptures. But God says the ought to be a man and a woman joined together, should be there forever. So Jesus makes this is-ought distinction himself. You can't get an ought from an is. Just because it's always been the case that a society loves little children, it doesn't mean that it ought to be that way simply because it is that way. You have to do more work than just say, well, that's the way it's always been. Okay?
Okay, you said that ought is a legal term. Is that what you said?
No, I said that it uses that the moral laws use the prescriptive oughts. Yes. So one ought to. It's a governing term. It's prescriptive in the way that legal laws, like driving down the road at a certain speed limit, you ought to do that. All right. But because we have these ideas, these concepts, and these concepts don't necessarily link to anything physical, the idea that one ought not to, say, be bigoted. We're going to do a whole Q&A session at the end too, so hold on to them. The idea that all of these things, like I said, that people might be bigoted, you know, that doesn't exist in a physical plane. It's not like saying the river should run this way instead of that way because the gravity is and the path is easier and things like that. These oughts, these moral laws, are kind of metaphysical. They don't exist in a physical realm. There's something more to them than that. Matter of fact, the idea of moral obedience means that a person can choose, and we're going to talk about that. But that means that these kinds of issues, these kinds of ideas, and that's really what they are, if they're moral ideas, then they have to exist in a mind. And this is the Christian position, that it is God that anchors all of morality, that we didn't come up with these things on our own, but that God, who is good, establishes these moral ideas. And without a mind that exists from all eternity, then these ideas of ought and not ought don't make any sense. In a physical world, moral laws are unintelligible. In other words, because if you think back, let me put it back this way. Think back before all of creation. Was it wrong? Would murder be considered wrong before there was a creation? Well, I think so. I think God has a certain idea. We can think of things like maybe I don't have a grandson yet, but if I had a grandson, it would be wrong to favor my granddaughter over him. Let's just say that, okay? So I'm not in that position, but I can know the right and wrongness of something even though that thing doesn't exist. So is there a right and wrongness? Does moral law obtain even prior to creation? And the Christian would say yes, it's not dependent upon creation in order to obtain. If it's dependent upon creation, then you've got some other issues going on because it becomes a deterministic system. So when we talk about morality, any moral theory must account for 3 components. Number 1, there are moral obligations. So if we're talking about any kind of morality, morality must include moral obligations. that there are real laws, duties, things to which we must obey, practice, or abstain from in the other case. Laws and obligations are things we're required to do. These may be held by some, they may be held by everybody, or they may be held by nobody. But just because they're held by somebody or nobody doesn't mean that they don't exist, and doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them. The other thought example I've often given is, imagine if Germany won World War II, and they subjugated the entire world. They got control of the educational system. They were successful on the final solution, right? They were able to wipe all the Jews out from the face of the planet, just as an experiment, or imagine that. We're now, 70 years later, we have an entire generation of people who've never known a Jewish person, who've only read in their history school books that what Adolf Hitler accomplished was a glorious thing, what was for the betterment of all humanity. And all these people believe this. Everybody on earth holds that to be true. Would it make it right that Hitler exterminated the Jews, even if everybody believed it? Well, no. So it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. Moral obligations sit in another place. These obligations sit beyond what we hold to be true. They are independent of us, and we are obligated then to perform them. Now, these obligations may conflict with our desires, as I've talked about before. It doesn't matter. Just like insulin, we are obligated to hold them, even if we don't like them. This is what a lot of people today really bristle at. You want to have a lot of fun, just go to a woman's group, any Christian women's group, and start talking about the word submission. And watch the discussions that come out of that. It's really interesting. Now, there's ways that, pastors will soften this and say, well, you are to be submissive one to another. And I agree with that. That's biblical, absolutely. And Jesus was submissive to us. He washed the feet of the disciples as an example, right? You're not supposed to sit at the head of the table. You're supposed to sit at the end. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but came to be a servant of all. So all of that is true. But yet there's still something in us that says, submit to him, I don't know. Right? Well, it doesn't matter if you like it or not. The question is, what is it actually trying to do, and am I being obedient to it? Morality confers obligations or constraints not only on our behaviors, but also on our motivations. And this is really interesting to me. What do I mean by that? Imagine a man running into a burning building and pulling out a small child. Press is there. They take photographs. Man, I can't believe you risked your life in order to say that. He would be a hero. Would we agree? Yeah, it would be a big deal. Now, imagine that 3 days later you found out that the man called the press. He knew the child would be in the building, and he ran in to save her in order to look good on TV. Does his motivation now change your opinion of the man? Absolutely. Why? Because moral obligations have their own weight, and we should be doing them, right? Doing duty for duty's sake, not doing duty for self-aggrandizement. If the only reason we're keeping moral law is to make ourselves look better, we've got a big problem. So part of moral obligation is that they confer those obligations upon our motivations as much as they do upon our actions. That's a big deal. Okay, so a moral theory must have moral obligations, and those moral obligations have to be authoritative. Secondly, moral theory must account for moral freedom. And this is kind of self-explanatory, but I'll tell you down the road while I'm getting into it. We are free agents to make free decisions. First thing, this is why you don't call a black widow spider a murderess for, eating her husband after they mate. And I guess only a third of them do that, but still, it's not a good ratio that I'd like to be a part of. Lions killing gazelles, right? You don't say, oh, that lion is evil. I know Disney likes to kind of put spins on things, but in this instance, those animals are compelled by their instincts to survive, and they do it in the only way that they can through these acts which are ultimately not necessarily controlled by the individual. These instincts are inborn in them. They're there, they exist. But human beings are moral agents because we have the ability to choose whether we act on our urges or not, as I talked about before, right? Just because we have a desire to take the pretty bob that's in the department store window, I really want it. The store's got lots of money, they'll not miss it. There's 30 of them there. Just because we have the desire doesn't mean that we should act on it. Those that do act on it, you know, kleptomaniacs, right? Though we say, oh, you're ill, you have a problem, you're not processing right. There's some defection in your mental processes that stops you from being able to do so. This is where we get the idea of innocent by insanity or temporary insanity or however the legal things do. We have to be free agents and able to make meaningful decisions. Let me give you another thought. This is what ethicists do, is they think about all these situations to try and make their point. Imagine that there is a scientist. The scientist's name is Smith. And Smith is a brilliant neurosurgeon who creates an implant that he puts in the head of Jones. Now, this implant will fire the neurons that will make Jones do only one thing: fire a gun. Okay? That's all it'll do. Smith can push a button, fire that implant, and Jones will pick up and fire a gun. Okay. Smith has planned this great feat because what he really wants to do is he wants to murder West. He doesn't like West. West is a competitor. And he wants West dead, but he doesn't want to get caught for it himself. So he figures this is the perfect frame-up. Okay? So he has Jones in a room, and he has the gun on the table, and in walks West. And Smith is watching through a two-way mirror. Now, in the course of their interaction, Jones and West get into an argument, and it gets pretty heated. Jones picks up the gun, right? And Smith is saying, this is my chance, and he picks up the controller. Before he has a chance to push the button, Jones pulls the trigger and kills West. Is Smith responsible for that, or is Jones responsible for that? Jones is, because Smith, right? Either way, West was going to die. Either Smith was going to push the button and the gun was going to get fired, or Jones. But because Jones acted freely without the control of Smith, he's now morally culpable for the death of West. Smith may be culpable for premeditation, planning a murder, other things, but he's not culpable for the murder itself. Jones actually is. So you have to be free moral agents because you have to be able to choose whether to do the good or not the good. We have the ability to choose the good. And the Bible tells us this, that with every temptation you have the ability to overcome it. Sometimes that ability feels absolutely this small and the temptation feels this big. But we do have the ability to overcome it. There's not a temptation where we can say, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I mean, maybe there's the trolley example, what you're trying to do when you're weighing the options of, well, what do I do? You're trying to minimize the damage, right? And sometimes you try to do the good with, say, the whole concept of hiding Jews in your attic or your basement. And, yes, lying is wrong, but having people die is worse, so you lie in order to save lives. You try to maximize the good in those situations. So any moral theory must account for moral obligations, must account for moral freedom, that we have the ability to choose these things. It's not fair to say a man who is, say, taken captive by ISIS, and ISIS tells him, you either stab this one man or we chop the heads off of these 10. That man really doesn't have the choice of which way to go. I mean, so he's stuck, or the trolley driver. You don't consider him morally culpable, you just consider him in a terrible situation trying to figure it out. And then thirdly, there's some genuine responsibility that's imparted to the individual for doing or not doing this. Okay, again, if it's chocolate versus vanilla ice cream, there's no real responsibility there. It doesn't matter what you choose. There's no consequence to that. Maybe you enjoy it less, but that's not a big deal. but there should be some genuine responsibility that follows from these actions. There's some type of consequence, at least possible. At least possible. It doesn't always follow. People may do wrong things and get away with it. Matter of fact, the psalmist talks about that. Remember Psalm 72, why do the wicked prosper, O Lord? I'm sitting here suffering and they're living in the great houses. And he was actually agonizing why the wicked got all the good stuff. And he said, until I saw their end, until I knew that ultimately they would be thrown into Sheol and I would be in the presence of God. There is a consequence to the action. These three things make moral obligations meaningful. The fact that you have moral freedom and you have a responsibility that is going to be consequential in some way, shape, or form. This is what gives moral law some binding upon us. Okay? So moral obligations, moral freedom, and a genuine responsibility to follow those. Those are necessary in a moral framework.